Hello. Listen, my mother has been working in office for 20 years, and it's from her I know how much lies behind the facade of her calm. The story is not just for views, it's something that could really happen to anyone, inspired by real situations. Names and companies are fictional. The main thing is you could recognize yourself and not repeat other people's mistakes, especially around New Year's Eve.
I knew the meeting mattered the second I heard my name casually dropped, wrongly pronounced, of course, by a junior exec who couldn't tell a P&L from a paperclip. "She'll be down soon," he chirped at the investor, like I was some intern fetching croissants. I was holding 2 coffees, double-checking the talking points I'd finalize at 2:15 a.m., when Lucas, our brand new VP of product, came barreling around the corner, eyes locked to his phone, ego trailing behind like cheap cologne. He slammed into me. The coffee soaked his sleeve. He stopped, looked down, looked up. "Are you blind?" he hissed, flicking his arm like I'd contaminated him with budget season germs. I blinked. "I'm so sorry. Here." I pulled out napkins, offering one like a white flag. That's when he said it, loud, so the glass walls caught it, bounced it, amplified it. "Do you even know who my dad is? You're fired." Just like that. Like we were at a Vegas pool party and he was cutting off someone's bar tab. Before we go any further, if you're listening and haven't hit that subscribe button or liked the video yet, do it now. Seriously. It helps our team keep finding these insane real-life stories and sharing them with you. Otherwise, you'll miss how this absolute circus unfolds next. Now, back to the hallway where I stood, soaked in espresso and disbelief, napkin still hovering in midair. He turned and walked off like he'd just performed some corporate mercy killing, leaving me standing there with 2 cups of coffee and 12 years of service unraveling at my feet. I didn't move. Not at first, because honestly, I was still trying to process what just happened. HR hadn't been called. No warning. No witnesses outside a few product interns pretending not to hear. It was the kind of impulsive tantrum that should have come from someone losing a video game, not a leadership title. But then muscle memory kicked in. And instead of going to my desk to draft a defense, I stepped into the elevator and hit G for lobby. Because 10 feet from that hallway disaster was the real reason I came in today. James Trent from Stratline Capital. He'd backed us in Series B, he'd doubled down for Series C, and if today went well, he was going to lead Series D. And if that went well, Eastvale would finally have the leverage it needed to expand across verticals and punch above its weight in a market drowning in prettier logos and seed-funded fluff. So I walked out into the lobby, still holding one unspilled coffee, and there he was. James Trent, calm, browsing his phone like we weren't on the verge of a capital event that would define the next 5 years of the company. I sat down beside him. "We might need to reschedule," I said quietly. He looked up. "Why's that?" I didn't flinch. "Lucas just fired me, upstairs, just now." His face didn't change, but his eyes locked on. "Wait, Lucas Hamilton? Gerald Hamilton's son?" I nodded. James let out a breath. One of those long, exhausted exhales that said he'd been waiting for this company to trip over its own shoelaces. Then, slowly, he lifted his phone, opened his camera roll, and turned the screen toward me. "Is this the guy who fired you?" It was Lucas, from the last All Hands, fumbling through a demo I had written, designed, and bulletproofed for him. He'd tripped over acronyms, skipped key metrics, and butchered the delivery so badly we had to send a follow-up deck to every single stakeholder. I had done that, after hours, while he got tagged in selfies on a rooftop with people who think synergy is a type of salad. James smiled. It wasn't warm, it was surgical. "Well then," he said, pocketing his phone. "Let's go see how Gerald feels about his son firing the person who's been holding this company together." We rose together. Me, the newly fired, him, the man with the money, and we headed for the elevator. I was still holding his napkin when he shouted it. "You're fired." Like we were in a movie and he thought he was the star. His voice cracked just slightly on the word, like his vocal cords weren't used to actual authority. A few people looked up from their screens behind the glass panels. One of the engineers blinked. Another looked away. Nobody said a word. Lucas didn't wait for a response. Just brushed past me, dripping in half a latte and full of self-importance. I stood there, not because I was frozen, but because I was calculating. 12 years. No write-ups, no reprimands. Half the org chart still ran on SOPs I'd written during the Redfern crisis. The irony? I was on my way to smooth over Lucas's last screw-up with Stratline, personally. The deck he was about to present, I'd finished formatting it at 3:17 a.m. He hadn't even opened it. I took a slow breath and looked at my reflection in the chrome elevator doors. One sleeve stained, the other hand still gripping two coffee cups like I was some overpaid barista in a pantsuit. I could hear him down the hall, already barking something about cleaning house like he was on a reality show. I thought about walking to HR, thought about sending a Slack to legal, but both of those ideas felt small. Instead, I walked to the elevator, pressed G, and held the full coffee steady all the way down. I adjusted my blouse, wiped my hand on my skirt, and pulled the talking points from my pocket. There was still a meeting to be had, and if Lucas was the clown in the circus, I had no intention of letting him juggle the future of the company unsupervised. The investor, James Trent, looked up from his phone when I approached. I gave him the coffee, his still hot, and sat down beside him. He raised an eyebrow. "You okay?" I nodded. "Lucas just fired me." James blinked like I'd said I was headed to space. "Fired you?" In the hallway, after I spilled coffee on his sleeve. His expression didn't shift, but something behind his eyes lit up. Not amusement, recognition. The way someone looks when the final piece of a bad puzzle falls into place. He tapped his phone a few times, then turned it to me. "This the guy?" It was a paused video frame. Lucas, on a stage at our last all hands, clutching a mic like it was a sword and somehow managing to butcher every single point I'd written for him. "Stratline almost pulled out because of this," James said flatly. "But I told them we had other people holding the structure together." I met his gaze. "You weren't wrong." He grinned. "Come upstairs. Let's talk to Gerald, Lucas's dad. The CEO, the man who'd once told me in private I was his insurance policy against incompetence." Guess the policy lapsed. We stepped into the elevator, James calmly sipping his coffee. Me? I left my cup behind on the bench. No use carrying the mess upstairs again. I had a better delivery to make. I didn't even look back. The napkins hit the trash with a dull thud, and I stepped into the elevator like it was just another Tuesday. My pulse was steady. But something inside me had clicked off. Whatever gear lets you pretend that politics is just business. I'd been loyal. I'd eaten years of undercredit, sat through ego parades disguised as leadership meetings, been the one who fixed the messes quietly while others collected applause. And now I'd been fired over a coffee stain in a hallway by a nepotism case in loafers who couldn't spell EBITDA if you painted it on his Tesla. When the elevator doors slid open, the lobby was quiet. Polished floors, a soft hum from reception, and there, like a scene from a different timeline, sat James Trent. He looked up from his phone right as I walked over, still holding the coffee I didn't spill. "We might need to reschedule," I said, my voice calm but clipped. No tremble, no spin. His brow creased. "Why?" I lowered myself into the chair beside him, legs crossed, posture perfect. "Lucas just fired me." A blink. That was it. Followed by a slow smile that started at the corner of his mouth and spread like a headline he'd been expecting. "Wait," he said, leaning forward. "Lucas Hamilton? Gerald's kid?" I nodded once. He let out the kind of laugh you try to stifle in church. Not loud, but full of disbelief. "Oh, that's rich," he muttered, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward me. A still frame of Lucas, blurry and sweaty, fumbling with a clicker during last quarter's all hands. I remembered that day. I'd coached him through that entire deck. He skipped 3 critical metrics, misread our churn data, and at one point called our flagship integration tool that connector thingy. "Tell me this is the guy who just fired you," James said, mock serious. I tilted my head. That would be the one. He exhaled and leaned back, staring at the ceiling like he was trying not to scream. "You realize I've been walking Stratline's board back from the ledge after that presentation?" I nodded again. "And now he just cuts the person holding the back end together like it's a middle school talent show." "Without HR," I added. "No cause, no paperwork, no process." James looked at me for a long beat. "Do you want to cancel this meeting?" I shook my head. "I think we should move it upstairs." There was a moment of silence between us, one of those professional pauses where mutual understanding replaces small talk. He stood. smoothed his blazer. Let's go see how Gerald feels about this. We walked toward the elevators together. The receptionist didn't even look up. Just another pair of suits headed upstairs. But I felt the shift. Something had fractured up there. Lucas just didn't know it yet. And Gerald was about to learn the hard way that his son's tantrum wasn't just a PR risk. It was a deal breaker. We stepped into the elevator, no words, just floor 9 blinking back at us. James sipped the coffee I brought him, glanced at me sideways, and said under his breath, "If this goes how I think it will, you might want to hang on to that consulting clause you mentioned last quarter." I didn't smile. I just said, "It's already printed." And the doors closed. Inside the elevator, James didn't speak for a moment. He just pulled out his phone and started scrolling like this was a coffee break and not a slow unraveling of someone's corporate delusion. His thumb moved with purpose, and I knew he wasn't just checking email. He was hunting. Then, without warning, he tapped play and turned the screen toward me. There he was, Lucas, mid-stammer, choking on acronyms he didn't understand, sweat blooming through his shirt collar as he butchered the product roadmap I had written start to finish. That all hands had been streamed to 3 regional offices and clipped for stakeholders. I'd watched from the back of the room, gritting my teeth as he skipped half the critical updates and ad-libbed metrics that didn't exist. James let the video run for another few seconds before pausing it on Lucas's face, mouth open, mid-flub. "I've been trying to convince Stratline not to block your D round because of this," he said, his tone dry. "We came close. Board skittish. You know how it is. Young blood, big titles, no delivery. We start wondering if the whole place is just soft veneers and inherited access." He slipped the phone into his pocket and looked at me fully. "So, tell me, was the firing formal?" I shook my head. No documentation, no HR, just an ego explosion and poor aim. James let out a slow breath, the kind that says perfect. But his expression never shifted from professional neutrality. "Good," he said, "because I want to watch Gerald's face when he realizes his son just fired the person who convinced us to stay in the last round." We reached the executive floor. The elevator gave its usual polite chime. The air was colder here, literally and otherwise. Carpet that cost more than my first car. Art that tried too hard. And a boardroom down the hall where people like Lucas played pretend with real money. James stepped out ahead of me, not rushed, not tense, just purposeful. "I want you to say exactly what happened," he said without turning around. "No more, no less. No dramatics, just facts. Let me handle the rest." We walked the corridor in silence, but I could hear my own footsteps louder than usual. I knew what was coming. Not just confrontation, but the slow unmasking of all the empty suits that had floated upward while I anchored everything down. James pushed open the door to the boardroom like he owned it. Technically, in a few hours, he might. Inside, Lucas was already seated, gesturing with big hands and inflated confidence, mid-spiel about operational optimization. My chair was empty, my nameplate already pushed aside. I wondered if he'd thrown it himself. The moment he saw us, the color drained from his face. James walked in like a storm cloud with manners, placed his notebook on the table, and smiled at Gerald, who looked up, pleasantly surprised, until he spotted me behind him. "I have a quick question before we get started," James said. "Who authorized this termination?" Gerald blinked. "What termination?" Lucas made a small sound, like a balloon deflating. "There was an incident," he muttered. James turned to me. "Would you mind repeating what happened?" I stepped forward and did. Calm, clear, no spin, just a spilled coffee, a snapped insult, and a shouted firing in front of half the product floor. No one interrupted me. When I finished, the silence was biblical. Gerald didn't blink. James leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers once against his coffee cup, like it was a gavel. "Well," he said, "now this is going to be interesting." Lucas was already in performance mode when we stepped into the boardroom. He stood near the screen, gesturing like a late-night infomercial host selling a product he couldn't explain. "Restructured redundancies," he was saying. "Tightening org weight. Made some calls this morning. Necessary ones." The board nodded slowly, like they were digesting without chewing. Gerald sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, half listening. Lucas had a confidence that only made sense if no one in the room had ever seen his work up close. Then he looked up, saw me, and James beside me. The pause was microscopic, but it was there. His throat caught. His hand stopped mid-air. James didn't give him time to recover. He walked straight to the table, set his notebook down with a quiet thud, and said, "Before we begin, I just have one quick question." The room stilled. Even the intern taking notes looked up. "Who authorized this termination?" James asked, glancing casually around the room like it was a routine compliance check. Silence. Lucas opened his mouth, but Gerald beat him to it. "What termination?" Gerald asked, tone still polite, but I saw his brow twitch. Lucas coughed. "There was an incident this morning. A disruption." James tilted his head. "Disruption?" Lucas fidgeted. "Look, I had to make a quick call. There was a spill. She reacted poorly. I cut in. Calm. Even. Lucas collided with me in the hallway. My coffee spilled on his sleeve. I apologized. He looked me in the eye and said, 'Do you even know who my dad is?' Then shouted, 'You're fired,' loud enough for 2 interns and the entire product floor to hear. No emotion. Just fact." Gerald turned his head slowly toward his son. I'd seen that look before. Not anger. Worse. Disappointment wrapped in embarrassment. "Lucas," he said, "did you fire her?" Well, it was in the moment. She, James said flatly, is the one who onboarded Stratline during Series B. She coordinated your API migration after your London vendor walked. She wrote the playbook you presented last quarter. And she's the only reason my board didn't pull out after watching you flounder through it. Another silence. Then James added, "She also brought the coffee you're drinking now." Lucas flinched. Gerald exhaled through his nose. "Did you file anything with HR?" Lucas shook his head. "Was legal informed?" Another head shake. Gerald looked at the head of HR. "Have you received any formal termination paperwork today?" "No," she said, barely above a whisper. James folded his hands on the table. "Then, unless we're now allowing hallway firings and sons with executive immunity, I'd suggest we clarify. Was this firing legitimate, or are we now running Eastvale like a reality show?" The room didn't breathe. Gerald leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Lucas wilted. I stood there quietly, hands clasped, watching a decade of my work speak louder than anything Lucas could blurt out. And in that moment, it was clear. The boardroom wasn't just watching. They were remembering every deadline I'd saved, every late-night call, every crisis I'd solved before it made headlines. Lucas didn't just fire someone, he exposed himself. Gerald turned to HR, jaw tight. "Was there any paperwork filed regarding her termination?" "No," the HR director replied, her voice brittle. "Nothing came through formal channels. We have no record of action taken today." He pivoted toward legal. "Any formal cause submitted, or even an informal heads up?" The general counsel just shook her head once. "Nothing on our side. We weren't alerted to any incident." James exhaled like a man slowly releasing the brakes on a train headed straight for a wall. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and gave Lucas a smile that was somehow both polite and weaponized. "So," he said, tapping his fingers against his coffee cup, "just so I'm absolutely clear on this timeline, you fired the person who's handled every key vendor integration for the last 6 years, who negotiated the supply continuity clause that saved you from the Redfern fallout, who personally closed your Series B and C prep documents, and who," he tapped again, "holds the only active admin login for Stratline Capital's audit dashboard." Lucas said nothing. His mouth opened slightly like he might say, "That's not true," but even he knew better. Everyone in that room had leaned on me at some point. They all knew. James raised an eyebrow. "And you did all that because of a coffee spill?" You could hear a pin drop. Gerald didn't say a word. His face had gone 2 shades paler, like someone had pulled a plug behind his eyes. "I'll remind the room," James continued, tone still surgical, "that Stratline was preparing to confirm lead investment status in your Series D today. Not next month. Not next quarter. Today." He let the last word hang there like a punchline no one wanted to laugh at. Gerald finally found his voice. Let's be reasonable. James didn't blink. Oh, I'm being very reasonable. You see, I had questions this morning about continuity, about leadership depth and operational risk. I walked in here expecting to discuss strategy. Instead, I find out your new VP fired the one person I told my partners was the glue holding this company together. Gerald glanced sideways at Lucas, who was now staring at the floor like it might swallow him if he looked sad enough. There's been a misunderstanding, Lucas mumbled. James looked at me. Did you misunderstand being told you were fired? No, I said calmly. He was loud and clear. James turned back to the table. So unless Eastvale wants Stratline walking into a board call this afternoon with lead removed due to coffee-related altercation as the summary, I suggest we reevaluate what's real and what's ego. The boardroom stayed quiet, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses on everyone's ribcage at once. Gerald's hands were folded, knuckles white, the lines in his forehead deepening by the second. Lucas looked like a balloon someone had let the air out of mid-sentence. I didn't move, didn't flinch. I just watched the same people who had nodded through Lucas's every buzzword now try to make themselves invisible behind notepads and laptops, because no one wanted to admit it aloud, but they all saw it now. He didn't just spill coffee on his sleeve, he spilled gasoline. And James Trent, he was holding the match. Gerald shifted in his chair, lips tight, eyes darting between Lucas and James like he was calculating which fire was smaller. He finally cleared his throat, slow and measured, the way CEOs do when they're trying to sound like adults while standing on a rug that's just been yanked out from under them. Let's be reasonable, he said, forcing a thin smile. This sounds like it wasn't an official termination, just a misunderstanding maybe, a heat of the moment thing. Lucas didn't even try to defend himself. He muttered, "It wasn't planned." Like that somehow made things better. James didn't bother looking up from his phone. "Great," he said flatly. "Then I'll just draft a note to Stratline letting them know your D-round stability depends on hallway tantrums and legacy hires with boundary issues. Should go over well with the partners." He was already typing. Gerald's voice caught. "Wait." James looked up. "Or you can explain it. But let's be clear, the next message Stratline receives will either confirm our lead position in this round or explain why we walked. I don't care who sends it. I'm just giving you the courtesy of choosing your own spin." The boardroom stayed painfully still. Gerald looked like he'd swallowed a thumbtack. A few people exchanged glances. No one wanted to say the obvious, that James Trent was now dictating the terms of not just the funding round, but the power structure inside the company. Then Gerald turned to me. His voice softened, but not with warmth, with urgency. "Do you still want to be here?" It was meant to sound generous, like he was offering me a graceful path back in, but I saw it for what it was. A desperate attempt to reabsorb the person his son had just shoved out a window. I didn't answer. Not immediately. I reached into the folder I'd brought downstairs that morning, the one that had my notes for the investor meeting, the one Lucas never bothered to read, and pulled out a single document. I slid it across the table. "This is my updated consulting agreement," I said, "retroactive to today." The legal counsel leaned forward instinctively to read it. Gerald didn't stop her. "Same scope of work," I continued. "Different terms. Monthly retainer, remote structure, board-level reporting, limited to operational integration. I'm happy to assist during the transition period." Gerald's mouth opened slightly. "You had this prepared?" I finally smiled, just a little. "I've been preparing this for 6 months." Lucas made a noise, some hybrid of disbelief and mild panic. Gerald didn't react. He was too busy reading the clause halfway down the page, the one that made it very clear I wouldn't be re-entering the building, wouldn't be managing Lucas, wouldn't be available for late-night fire drills. I would advise, I would be paid, and I would be entirely out of their line of fire. James leaned over, glanced at the contract, then sat back with a quiet nod. "Well played," he said under his breath. Gerald didn't say anything for a long time. Then he picked up the pen from the middle of the table, signed the bottom, initialed the effective date line. Lucas stood frozen, his hand on the table, knuckles white. He looked like a man realizing the lifeguard had just swum away from his drowning chair. I stood, folded the copy into my folder, and offered a polite nod to the room. "I'll send my onboarding packet tonight. Let me know who will be managing weekly comms." And then I turned to James. You still want to lead the round? He grinned. Now more than ever. And just like that, I walked out of the room. Not fired, not salvaged, upgraded. By Monday morning, Lucas was suddenly on leave. The phrasing was deliberately soft, stepping back to reflect and realign, as if he'd gone on a soul-searching retreat instead of detonating his credibility in front of the company's most important investor. The internal email came out at 9:04 a.m. sharp, signed by Gerald, stamped with enough vague HR polish to make it sound like an executive development milestone, not a forced disappearance. A second memo followed 6 minutes later. That one had my name on it. We're grateful for Redacted's continued strategic support during this critical phase, it read. Her institutional knowledge and operational leadership remain vital as we navigate due diligence and integration efforts with our investment partners. That sentence might as well have been written in fireworks. No title, no office return, just strategic support. And yet somehow it said everything. The people who read between lines got the message. I wasn't coming back to be managed. I wasn't filling the gap Lucas left. I was the gap. And for the first time in a long time, I got to control the terms under which I operated. That same afternoon, I forwarded my revised consulting invoice to the board, triple my previous monthly salary. Tiered incentives for successful close of Series D, zero tolerance clauses for executive overreach or access bypass. My own counsel reviewed it before I sent it. One of Gerald's assistants replied 6 minutes later, approved. Meanwhile, Lucas was already trying to salvage his public image. A LinkedIn post popped up that Tuesday, a sepia-toned beach photo with a quote in cursive overlaid like a sympathy card. Growth begins where comfort ends. The caption was even worse, taking some time to reflect. Grateful for the lessons, humbled by the journey. Humbled by the journey? You tried to fire someone over a coffee stain and accidentally triggered an investor revolt. Lucas. I didn't comment. I didn't even hit like. I just archived the post along with the screenshot of him sweating through his button-down shirt during the infamous all-hands meeting. I had a folder now. I called it Fireproof. James and I had a standing Thursday check-in. Not with Eastvale, just between us. Planning, strategizing. Turns out the kind of quiet competence investors crave is a rare commodity, and once they find it, they don't like risking it to vanity hires and legacy handoffs. James made it clear, verbally at first, then through a very formal offer, that Stratline wanted me on the advisory board of 2 other portfolio companies. Paid, remote, no drama, just do what I already do, fix chaos, streamline ops, and quietly make overconfident men nervous. I accepted the first one. By Friday, Gerald sent a message through his assistant requesting a conversation to align long-term objectives. I replied, please direct all future scope discussions to the terms in Section 3 of the consulting agreement. I'm unavailable for calls until after the Series D finalization. No hard feelings, no revenge campaign, just boundaries and leverage and a rate they couldn't say no to, because I wasn't the one who lost control that day. I was the one who stopped pretending someone else had it. By the time Q2 rolled around, Eastvale had its funding. Series D closed. Stratline led the round. Gerald made a stiff little speech in the press release about next phase evolution and strategic stewardship. Corporate code for we almost blew it, but someone stepped in. No one said my name. They didn't have to. Every department head, every vendor, every investor who'd been on a call with me in the past decade knew exactly whose fingerprints were on that close. I stayed on just long enough to finish what I started. 3 months, stabilized handoffs, cleaned up old workflows, documented systems that should have been documented years ago. I trained a woman named Nadia to replace me, bright, grounded, sharp as hell. I told her on day 1, never let someone louder than you steal your credit. Smile, but document everything. Then I stepped out. Quietly. No going away email, no cupcake send-off, just one final check-in with James and a forwarded invoice marked Final Deliverables. By the end of summer, we'd formed our own advisory firm. He handled the investor side. I handled ops and recovery. It worked better than either of us expected. Companies in trouble didn't want charisma. They wanted someone who didn't panic at 3 a.m. when the server logs looked like smoke. And Lucas? He never came back. No formal announcement. Just gone. His office was cleared one weekend under the pretense of a workspace refresh. Last I heard, he'd pitched himself to a boutique startup in Austin, made it 6 weeks before ghosting them after a failed beta launch, still posting quotes about resilience, still hoping to fail upward into something with a corner office and no expectations. As for me, I sit in boardrooms now, the kind where they spell your name right on the door card, the kind where people actually read your bio before shaking your hand. I bring my own coffee to those meetings, always. And sometimes, when someone knocks into me too fast or fumbles a slide deck I wrote, I remember that hallway, that voice, that arrogance. Then I sip slowly, let the silence do the talking. Because here's what no one tells you when they hand you your first job title. Titles fade. Leverage doesn't. And when they tried to fire me, they didn't end my career. They licensed it.